This is the top 10. Top 10. This is the top 10. Hello YouTubers and welcome to Big Buddha is Watching. I'm Big Buddha. Don't worry, I'm not playing it throughout the entirety this time. I'm going to try something a little bit different with the breakups this time. Wore a bit thin by about number 9 on my top 10 favourite movies video. So, top 10 favourite TV shows. I haven't had as much time to think about what would go into my top 10 this time around. My top 10 movies list is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and I believe that was a definitive list. This was literally last night I sat down and thought, well, what would be in my top 10? Made a list of about 25 shows, so there's about 15 honourable mentions I could do. And whittled it down to 10. I kind of looked down the list and thought, well, which ones do I really love? Which ones have I watched the most over time? And you know, which ones mean the most to me? There's a lot of comedy shows on this list. I don't think there's any particular reason for that, really, other than, you know, I there's nothing I enjoy really more than when I'm watching TV than to laugh. And if a program can genuinely make me laugh, like a few have over time, then you know, it's just become one of my favourites. So about 7 or 8 of these are comedy shows, sitcoms if you like. So yeah, let's get on with it. This is my top 10 favourite TV shows. And at number 10 is Peep Show. This is a great sitcom, I think, and a really underrated sitcom in that, I mean, it is light, but it's kind of got a cult appeal, really. It was broadcast on Channel 4 between, I think, 2003 and I think they made the final series about 3 years ago in 2015. So they did 9 series of it, which, you know, it sounds a lot for a cult TV series, but in this day and age, a cult series can, or something that gets low viewing figures, can run for 9 series, 9 seasons, simply because, you know, everything on terrestrial TV now gets low viewing figures. So it's a cult series in that not everybody knows it, but the people who do know it, I think, really latch onto it, really love Peep Show, because it is, I think, the funniest show that's been on TV, well, this side of the 21st century, really. You have the comedy duo Mitchell and Webb, Robert Webb and David Mitchell. This is really where they first emerged onto the scene, even before they did their sketch show on BBC Two. A lot of people think that they wrote this, but in fact it wasn't them. It was Sam Bain and Jesse Armstrong. It centres around 2 characters, Mark and Jeremy, who share a flat. In series 1, they're 20-somethings. By series 9, they're both pushing 40. So it does kind of lapse into that danger area in the later series, where comedy kind of lapses over into tragedy, if you will, because you know, it's funny, 2 guys stuck in this awful situation in their 20s because, you know, they've got the rest of their life to get out of it. When you get the same characters lapsing into middle age in the final series, it took on an, I mean, there's sort of an air of tragedy that runs throughout the series anyway, but it took on, I think, an extra bit of gravitas in the final series when it finally dawned on you that, oh my God, you know, these characters could be stuck together forever, and sort of the horrible implications that entailed. The reason it's called Peep Show is the novelty about the series is that you see everything from the main character's point of view. Literally, every shot in the series is somebody's point of view, and you hear in voiceover what they're really thinking. So the comedy stems from, you know, what characters do say, what they really say in real life, and what they're thinking, their internal monologue. I think if you didn't have that element to it, it would be quite a dull show, really. Although, I mean, there are some very funny set pieces in the series. But I just love this series for the sort of no holds barred nature of the comedy. It really it mined a vein of 20 something humour that hadn't been tapped into before. It really defined a generation and the the predilections of 20 somethings in the new millennium, and it looked at sexual promiscuity and all the pitfalls that would entail, recreational drug use in consequence-free environments, and in a consequence-free environment, to quote Austin Powers. And you have, the ideal double act in Mark and Jeremy. You have Mark, who's almost a conservative character in many ways, and Jeremy, the more liberal-minded, free-spirited one, but dares to make Mark the sensible one, the voice of reason most of the time, and Jeremy to be the idiot. It's a very, very funny show if you haven't seen it, especially for, if anything, for the character of Super Hans, who's one of my favourite characters in any comedy show ever, and I'm still waiting for the Super Hans spin-off series. So yeah, number 10 of my top 10 favourite shows, Peep Show. Number 9 is a series that, it doesn't really have a name because each series had a different title, so I'm just going to call these Michael Palin travel docs or travel documentaries. I have a few here on DVD. That's the first one, Around the World in 80 Days, in which Michael Palin, who was, obviously a comedian when he made this, and he wasn't the first choice to host a travel documentary. But they decided, the BBC thought it would be a novel idea to try and recreate Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days and send somebody on the same route. The obvious choice at the time was Alan Wicker, but he passed. And then I think they asked Noel Edmonds to do it as well. Thank God that version didn't happen. But the third choice was Michael Palin, and he was an ideal choice to host a travel documentary because he's such an amiable figure. Anybody who ever worked with him says he's one of the nicest people to work with, just one of the nicest people they've ever met, and he's ideal to go around the world and go into some situations that some might deem dangerous, some parts of the world that you wouldn't normally want to go, but sending a character like Michael Palin in it is it just works wherever he goes because he's so nice and amiable to everyone, and interested in the minutiae of everyone's day-to-day life, and treats everyone on an equal plane. And so you see people, wherever he goes, just warm to him. Around the World in 80 Days was a great success. So off the back of that, they did many more. They did Pole to Pole, in which he travels from the North Pole to the South Pole. Full Circle, where he goes around the Pacific Rim, and then he started visiting different areas of the world, the Sahara Desert, the Himalayas, and through New Europe. This is really the only non-scripted series in my top 10 list. I'm not a big documentary watcher. Unless it's movie documentaries, that tends to be the stuff I gravitate towards. But I've done a little bit of travelling in my time, and I enjoy seeing parts of the world. And when I haven't done nearly as much travelling as I'd like to, but I always find with these shows is that they really fill in a lot of gaps in my knowledge that were lacking when it comes to what the rest of the world is like. And having an amiable host like Michael Palin makes it all very palatable. And these, I mean, are perfect Sunday afternoon viewing for me. You know, I can put these on and happily watch, 8 episodes in a row. This is great binge watching if you like documentaries and something informative and funny and very relatable and amiable. So number 9, Michael Palin travel docs. Number 8, and I don't have this on DVD, but it's going in there anyway, is Quantum Leap. The reason I put this at number 8 is this is really the first drama series I can remember being essential viewing for me. I'd seen a lot of American TV growing up, but stuff like Knight Rider, for example, is something that I just catch the odd episode. I'd watch as a time waste if it was on Star Trek: The Next Generation, The X-Files, even. Although The X-Files did become essential viewing, but Quantum Leap, I remember being that being the first series I'd watch, and religiously I'd sort of remember. Okay, I think it was on Thursdays at 9 o'clock on BBC Two, and I didn't see the first ever episode, but I think I started watching it round about the midway point on season 2, and I think after the first ever episode that I watched it religiously week after week after that. The plot, for those that don't remember Quantum Leap, is it was essentially, there was a series from the 1960s called The Time Tunnel, which was simply two scientists lost in a vortex in time, and the concept of that was that they'd arrive at a different point in history each week and essentially sort out a problem before they get sucked back up into the time tunnel. The stinger at the end of each episode was the period of history that they'd wound up in the next episode. So Quantum Leap was essentially that, but with a couple more rules thrown on it on top of that. You had Scott Bakula, who played Dr. Sam Beckett. He'd quantum leap, so he'd travel in time every week, but he could only travel within his own lifetime, so he couldn't go back further than, I think it was 1952, when the character was meant to be born. And he wouldn't appear as himself. He'd leap from body to body, so he'd take over a different personality. He'd take on a different personality each week. So one week he could be a concert pianist, the next he could be a gymnast. Quite often he'd leap into women. I think he was a single mother in one, and it got more and more outlandish with the scenarios as it went on. The famous one is he leapt into Lee Harvey Oswald in one episode. They played a bit fast and loose with the rules from time to time. There was one episode where he leapt into himself when he was 16. He always seemed to end up in North America, but in one he ended up in Vietnam, and his mission there was to save his brother. And I believe there's one where he ends up in the Civil War, but the way they got around that is he leapt into an ancestor of himself. So the genetic makeup meant they could cheat with the rules, and he could go back in time 100 years in that episode. But he would always, his mission each week was to always rewrite history and put right something that once went wrong in the past. And then what would draw you back each week. Whenever he leapt, you'd always see the first 2 minutes of the next episode, and he'd always leap into a new body, and it always seemed to be, he never just leapt into anybody who was, going about their business idly doing their taxes. He always seemed to leap into the person at the most inopportune moment. So if he leapt into a concert pianist, it would be a concert pianist right in the middle of a stage concert. Or if he leapt into a gymnast, he'd actually be on the trapeze when he leapt, which led to his catchphrase each week. Each episode ended with a sign off of Dr. Sam Beckett saying, "Oh boy," because of the situation that he found himself in. Loved it as a kid. Scott Bakula, and it was it was a really likable, amiable presence like Michael Palin, and Dean Stockwell is his hologram guide Al, who's a figure from the future, was also very solid as well, and there's great chemistry between the two characters, and the two actors. The one thing that still gripes me to this day is the final episode, because I watched it for years and I was just waiting for Sam Beckett to get home. I wanted him to get home. I love the character so much. I just wanted him to get back home to his wife and be happy. And that wasn't the resolution to the final episode, and it still hurts to this day that's not how that's not what the resolution was. I know why they did it. They were hopefully leaving it open because they weren't sure whether they were going to get cancelled, so they were hopefully maybe going to do more series down the line. But 25 years later, and still nothing's happened. So I don't understand because they're like the other shows on this series on my top 10 list. There's major cult appeal to Quantum Leap, so I don't understand why there hasn't been some attempt at a revival or a reboot or a movie version. It's so ripe for being brought back, because there's great love and there's great nostalgic value out there for Quantum Leap. But I'm sure there'll be something one day. There you go, number 8 on my list, Quantum Leap. Number 7 on my list is Doctor Who, both the classic and the revived series. It took the revival of the series to really cement Doctor Who as one of my favourite shows. I watched it as a kid, but it was cancelled. I was born in 1980 and the show was cancelled in 1989. So I was just getting into it, just starting to watch it religiously each week in the when they cancelled it in the Sylvester McCoy era. Which, the fact that I really latched onto it in having gone back and watched all the old episodes in easily the worst era of the show. It was the era of the show where the BBC just wasn't behind it, just wasn't putting the budget in there where it needed. It looked shoddy. They'd hired and fired doctors. Sylvester McCoy, he on paper he looked like he should have been a dead cert, but he really struggled to find his feet in the role. He got there towards the end, but he had a shaky start. So it really wasn't on solid ground, and I think it's a real testament to the strength of the concept that even at that point that I really started to latch onto the show. But in a way, thank God there was a 16-year hiatus. It went off in 1989, and I thought, oh well, that's just an old show they never made anymore. And it wasn't until they did the TV movie in 1996 with Paul McGann, but that was really not very good. They tried to tailor it towards the American market, but keep it canon. And they tried to please both bases, and it just ended up being a kind of nonsensical hybrid. But when it came back in 2005 with Christopher Eccleston, it was really, really good. And off the back of that, and we had 13 episodes a year, so it was a long wait between series. So off the back of that, I did go back and watch the entirety of the original series. It took me forever, I can tell you. It was all on YouTube, funnily enough, for a couple of years, and so basically it took me something like 11 months to get through it all, because there's like well over 700 episodes in existence, most of them 25 minutes long. And it was a whole year of just not going out. What am I doing tonight? I'm watching Doctor Who. um, and most weekends I was spent devouring Doctor Who. It's suffice to say I was single at the time. There's no way I'd be able to do that now in 11 months. But it took me doing that. Oh, and just to reiterate, I watched every single episode, even the ones that aren't in existence anymore, because a lot of the black and white episodes were wiped, but the audio from all the episodes still exist. So I was able to watch the fan reconstructions, which are made up of production stills and the audio, and often subtitled because the audio is such poor quality. So I really dedicated to it, and by the end I was just a Doctor Who fanatic. Doctor Who's something I'm going to talk about a lot more in the future, but I think it's a great series. I think it's one of the strongest concepts for a TV show ever. Really, a man who can go anywhere and do anything. When you have a concept for a show that's like that, it's never going to get stale. Every TV show reaches a stagnation point at some point, and the reason for that is you like with Peep Show, for example, which I although they made 9 series, they really should have stopped after 6, because the situation just becomes stagnant. It just becomes about the same characters in the same setting, going through the motions over and over again every week. And you've either got to shake things up, or you just stagnate and die. And the genius of Doctor Who is by its very nature, it has to be shaken up, because it is a different setting every week. It is a different story every week. And every few years, it's a different Doctor. Every couple of years, it's a different companion. So it constantly remains fresh, and it's pretty much the only series I think that can have a longevity like that. I even find soap operas a bit sinister in that way, in the way that they never end. Although there is a sort of constant renewal process with soap operas, where you get different characters coming in, and it's more about the setting than the characters per se. Even in soap operas, you get some characters who stay on year after year after year, and it just becomes unbelievable after a while. But Doctor Who, the premise works because, by its very nature, it has to be about regeneration, and so that's why it's lasted for now 55 years now, and long may it continue. Number 6 is Fawlty Towers. Love Fawlty Towers for years. It's the perfect sitcom. Did everything right. John Cleese and Connie Booth, who wrote it, they spent 2 years writing each series. They only made 2 series. They really honed the script. They'd spend 2 or 3 months on each script, really honing it and getting so that the plots were absolutely, and the structure was absolutely exquisite. So all the comic beats were there in it, and the build of momentum is just a masterclass in comedy structure, as well as comedy characters, but on top of that, it also works as the archetypal sitcom, because I think every successful sitcom really has to be about a family. Uh, Not strictly speaking a biological family, but you need to have a family structure, and you do get that with the four main principles in Fawlty Towers. Yeah, so you have Basil and Sybil, who are the parents, and um, Polly and Manuel, who are the children, and you see this similar sort of structure in a lot of other successful sitcoms. Father Ted, for example. I mean, I could not remember laughing at any, being just purely pent up with laughter at anything more in my life than when I first watched. I think it was the Germans episode, and the scene where the Major mistakenly thinks that the moose is talking to him, but really it's Manuel below the desk. When I first saw that, probably when I was 7 or 8 years old, and I didn't think it was possible to find something as funny as that. I didn't think it was possible to laugh as hard and as long as anything else, as anything as that scene. And I've really, for that, and I've laughed at all the episodes many many times over the years since. But I just still, to this day, I just still remember that, watching that episode on an early VHS copy that my uncle owned, and just to this day, it still fills me with joy to think of that moment, and I still really laugh at it when I watch it now. So that's why Fawlty Towers is at number 6 on my list. Number 5 is Newman and Medeel in Pieces. I put this in there because Newman and Medeel in Pieces is probably one of the most obscure shows on my list. You'll be forgiven if you've never heard of it, but I put it in there in the same way, I guess, if a lot of music snobs would put the Velvet Underground album, or what of a Velvet Underground album, in there. In that, the Velvet Underground were a band that only 5 people knew and liked when they were around originally, but they seem to influence everything that came after it. So if you've never heard of the Velvet Underground, you can bet your bottom dollar you like a band who were influenced by the Velvet Underground, or an artist. And I find there's a similar sort of thing going on in the world of comedy with Newman and Baddiel in Pieces. Rob Newman and David Baddiel were a comedy double act. They originally started in a show called The Mary Whitehouse, which was them two with the comedy duo Punt and Dennis. So they both do their stuff. If you know Punt and Dennis, they now present the Now Show on Radio 4. So they do sort of very safe Radio 4 political satire, and Newman and Baddiel, they were more the punky sort of arty types, all Oxbridge educated. The famous quote at the time I think it was from Rob Newman, was that the Mary Whitehouse experience was like trying to do a concept album with Shawaddy Waddy. So Newman and Baddiel in Pieces was the concept album. That was what they always wanted the Mary Whitehouse experience to be. They only did 7 episodes. It's never had a DVD release, and I think that's a real shame, because I think this series was far more influential than a lot of people give it credit for. yeah, there's only 7 episodes in existence. You can find them on YouTube. You can also find the live at Wembley Stadium show that they did. But I'd suggest that you watch the series first before you watch the live show, because the live show did rely heavily, I think, on you knowing all the in jokes from the TV show, and it was one of those series where they'd make a joke in episode one and they'd build on it week after week after week. So it paid off to stick with the show, even in its very short run. But Newman and Baddiel were, they kind of got the moniker, or were responsible for the comedy is the new rock and roll moniker that came after that. And you could see that, although they were comedians, they were kind of young and sexy and good looking, especially Rob Newman, who's kind of the Syd Barrett almost of comedy. He kind of disappeared off the scene for quite a while, and a very, very intelligent bloke, almost a genius, really. He's sort of returned to stand up in more recent years, but it's very, very erudite stuff. The stuff that he does now, I watch, and I find a lot of it hard to fathom. I must admit. You kind of watch it and go, is this stand-up comedy, or are we just getting a lecture on the state of world oil here? But I mean, I love Rob Newman for that the fact that he isn't still around now, and he's a guy now with sort of major concerns about the environment, and apparently he doesn't own a TV. He sort of shut himself off, and only wears second-hand clothes, and is quite an environmentally conscious fellow now, and that's his sort of that's what drives him these days. Really, is more global concerns. And David Baddiel, obviously he had the more traditional comedians career. I've always liked David Baddiel. I think he gets a hard press from a lot of people. A lot of people think he's smug, but I always found him very, very funny, because he suffers from insomnia, and he once said, at 5 o'clock in the morning, there's only 4 things on your mind: death, disease, famine, and should I have a fifth wank? It's one of my favourite jokes of all time. So if you haven't seen it, check it out. Newman and Baddiel in Pieces, a great, great comedy show. And I haven't even mentioned That's You, that is. Number 4 is I'm Alan Partridge. I've talked about this show before. You can go back and watch my previous videos on it. But yeah, I'm Alan Partridge is it was one of the shows that was at the forefront of kind of cringy humour that became very popular sort of post The Office. But I'm Alan Partridge really predates The Office by a good 3 or 4 years. You can see the first series now as sort of being the midway point between traditional studio-based sitcoms, which is what I'm Alan Partridge was, and the sitcom format as we know it now, which is something more single camera based, more naturalistic, and without a laughter track. Even though there was a laughter track on I'm Alan Partridge. Most TV shows I will only watch once, and it's very unusual that I'll watch something more than once. But there's something about Alan Partridge, especially I'm Alan Partridge, that just draws me back. I can just continually watch it and rewatch it, and there's something I don't know. There's something nice. There's something nice about the Norfolk setting. I mean, the character's really, really funny. I put that down to, I think, we think that Alan's awful, but really what we find awful is the projection. I think we all see something of ourselves in Alan. Our worst traits. He basically says there's no filter with Alan Partridge. He says all the worst things that we all think. The character works as well because he's not being malicious. He doesn't realise he's being awful, and because of that innocence, I think that's what makes him so likable and funny and relatable. Um, yeah, I don't know what more to say about the series other than what I said in my initial reviews that I did, I think back in September or October. So go because I did 4 videos on Alan Partridge. So go back and check those ones out if you want to see more views. But yeah, I'm Alan Partridge is. It doesn't really get the credit it deserves. I think it's easily up there with shows like The Office and Fawlty Towers as being one of the greatest sitcoms ever made, and certainly one of my favourite shows, definitely. Blackadder. For those of you who don't know, Blackadder was a sitcom that was produced by the BBC between 1983 and 1989. It had an unusual format. The first series was just a sitcom set in medieval times. Not the most successful iteration of the show. Usually, that show was written by Richard Curtis and Rowan Atkinson, who stars as Blackadder, and he was this snivelling, weaselly little character who lived, who was a relative. Yeah, he was the son of the non-existent Richard IV. There was like a rewriting of history there. But series 2 or Blackadder 2 is where the show really took off. That's really where it found out what it was meant to be. The first series was shot on location. I don't think it was shot in front of a studio audience. It was like kind of shot and played in later to a studio audience. I may be wrong about that. But Blackadder 2 brought things down. They brought Ben Elton in as the writer, so as you can imagine, if you know Ben Elton's work, it took on a far more childish bent the Blackadder. After Ben Elton came on board, it became much more of a traditional studio sitcom, but also it became unique in that from that point on, each series was set in a different time frame, and although it had essentially the same characters in each series, they weren't strictly speaking the same characters. They were meant to be descendants of the same characters, if you like. So the series 2 or Blackadder 2 is set in Elizabethan times. Blackadder the Third is set in Regency England, and Blackadder Goes Forth is set in the trenches of World War One. But essentially, you have the same characters in all of them, and running through each series. There's a little change in the format there, but again, like with Doctor Who, it's that change up of the format that keeps it fresh as it goes through. And arguably, that's a show that could have run much further than it did. They have made attempts to bring it back. They did a Millennium special, which I think is the closest we're ever going to get to a Blackadder movie. All about the modern day era Blackadder travelling back in time and meeting all his previous ancestors. There's a great Christmas special as well about Ebenezer Blackadder, which has a reverse on the format. He starts off as a good man and ends up a bad man because Blackadder is a very morally dubious character who's only ever in it for number one. The key to the series, which I never really realised until I saw interviews with the creators, was that he's essentially a 20th century man living in the past. So he's able to give his take on the past. So obviously, Whenever Shakespeare's mentioned, he rolls his eyes because he knows that about every bored school child that will be forced to sit through Shakespeare when they're at school. When it comes to when Charlie Chaplin's mentioned in Blackadder Goes Forth, he rolls his eyes because obviously back in the 1910s, people thought Chaplin was hilarious, but he sort of rolls his eyes because as a 20th century man, he finds Chaplin a little bit annoying and tedious. Funny enough, when I was at primary school, which is when I first saw Blackadder, my marks in history actually improved. That's how good the series was. I was so into the show. And if you want, there's one thing you can say about the show is that the history is pretty spot on. They don't really, apart from this first series, beyond the first, and even then, you can glean some knowledge from it. The Battle of Bosworth Field and what have you. But from the second series onwards, they do stick quite rigidly to the history of England as it happened, and so I grew up knowing about people like Shelley and Byron and Dr. Johnson and Sir Walter Riley, just from off the back of Blackadder, and I think it instilled a love of history in me at an early age. And as I mentioned before, having Ben Elton write it made it very palatable for children. I think it did have a large fan base of children, Blackadder, because as well as the history and the clever writing, there was a proliferation of knob and fart gags throughout it. So it made it very palatable for children. There's some really, really silly stuff in the second series. I mean, just watch the first scene or the second scene of the first episode. Where Baldrick's talking about his lucky willy that he's just put there. It doesn't make any sense. He's got a willy that he takes on and off. It's so silly and childish. It gets praised to high heaven now as this. What a fine piece of comedy, what a fine era-defining work, a work of great maturity now. But and to be fair, I mean, the final episode is still one of the most powerful bits of TV ever filmed. I do know that, but that doesn't detract from the fact that it is also a really, really silly series. It's so much so that Tony Robinson, who plays Baldrick, he created the TV series Maid Marian and Her Merry Men. Simply as a reaction to the fact that he found that his daughter, who was probably about the same age as me, really liked Blackadder, and he thought, okay, there's a market here to do a kids program, which is essentially, and that's what Maid Marian and Her Merry Men was. It was Blackadder for children. There you go, a series I absolutely love, and it makes number 3 on my top 10 list. Number 2 is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Rather criminally, I don't have the DVD. It's something I've been meaning to purchase, but I have watched it many, many times. I did have it on VHS for a long, long time. I haven't watched it in a while, but when I did own it, I watched it religiously. I mean, Hitchhikers is more all-encompassing than just the TV show, and it's something I do intend to do many more videos on in the future, probably next year. I miss the fact that it's the 40th anniversary of the radio series, which is what it started in, which is what the TV series was based on. I think that's been and gone just the other week, so I missed that. But the best iteration of Hitchhiker's Guide is the novel, which I will probably do some videos to coincide the 40th anniversary of that being published next year. But the TV show is, I think, the best live action version, far better than the film, which I did enjoy the film, but it has its problems. It was made in 1981, and it was really, although it kind of looks like a comedy version of Doctor Who now. It has got the shaky sets and some questionable makeup in it, but it was. I mean, for what the BBC was doing at the time, it was pretty state of the art, especially the guide sequences. Douglas Adams, who wrote it, he created something that was unlike any other comedy show at the time. It was essentially a sitcom, but there was no studio audience, there was no laughter track. It was set in space. It dealt with very dense, heady sci-fi themes. It wasn't a parody of science fiction. I think it works as a great piece of science fiction in its own right because of the great philosophical themes. It had a narration, which was because the central character of Ford Prefect, he works for the thing called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He's a reporter and he goes out reporting on anything, and he got stranded on Earth because in the midst of writing his report on Earth, which after 15 years culminated in just 2 words, which was Mostly Harmless, the name of the 5th book. I mean, and so in the series you get these great bits of narration with these very very state of the art for 1981 bits of animation, which kind of predicted where we are now. That the Hitchhiker's Guide, the actual prop in the show, I mean, it looks like a modern day iPad. To all intents and purposes, when they access the guide in this show, they're basically just reading the internet. But this was 1981. This was 15 years before the internet even existed or was available to the mass market. So as well as being quite I don't know what the word is, but it was almost a bit of prophecy, the Hitchhiker's Guide, and full of great characters. Arthur Dent the Everyman, Ford Prefect, who was an alien who was stranded on Earth, and after his minimal amount of research suggested that would be a good inconspicuous name for Prefect. You have Zaphod Beeblebrox, the president of the galaxy, who has 2 heads, and Trillian, she's the girl. She's probably, Adams himself said she was a sort of criminally loose, undefined character. He gave her a bit more depth in the subsequent novels. And of course, everyone's favourite character, Marvin the paranoid android, a robot with depression. So I love it because it's a great bit of science fiction. It's a great story. Each episode this sort of builds on this story. Just the imagination that it shows. At one point, Arthur ends up on a planet that's business is to construct custom-made planets, and then they find out that they made the Earth, and that the Earth wasn't actually a planet but a giant supercomputer designed to find the ultimate question. Now the ultimate answer. No, the ultimate question, the ultimate answer of life, the universe, and everything. The ultimate answer was 42, but they didn't know what the question was. And just when you think that's all going in one direction, they suddenly get zapped to the other end of time, and the restaurant at the end of the universe, a restaurant where you can view the collapse of the universe. And it all wraps up rather neatly with the characters back on prehistoric Earth. Amazingly, they only did the one series. I don't think Douglas Adams was overly happy with how the series came out. Although he was a bit of a mad perfectionist. I think it's a shame because I'd have loved to have seen a second series. That he was sort of toying with the idea of doing one based on the third novel, Life of the Universe and Everything, which was based on a kind of rejected idea that he had from his time writing on Doctor Who. So there's that connection there as well. But as you can see, I'm a great fan, and I could talk for hours about Hitchhiker's Guide. But stay tuned for my videos that I plan to do next year, where I'll go more in depth on that series. So that was my number 2 choice, and now let's reveal what my number 1 is. Okay, I'm cheating a little with this one, so call it a top 11 if you like. But I mean, the reason is simply that, I don't want to do 11, but I couldn't choose between these two. I really couldn't. They've both been my favourite show, my favourite TV show now since probably about the early 90s. I probably watched these two for the first time in about 1991, and so what an era for television that was for me personally. So bottom and Red Dwarf. As you know, I've talked about Red Dwarf ad nauseum in I did something like 14 videos on it recently, reviewed every single series, and actually only just recently I did a Getting Bigger all about some of the foods. There's still more to come, believe me. I do have it's the 30th anniversary of that show this year, so I might do some more to coincide with that. Now that I know how to edit clips into videos as well, I think there's more fun, there's more scope to have with Red Dwarf. But yeah, as you know, Red Dwarf, a more traditional sitcom than Hitchhikers in that it was a studio-based program. There was Hitchhikers was studio, but I mean studio audience based. They had the studio audience, they had the single sets, so it was at least in the early days it was kind of more like a studio-based sitcom in space. But as it progressed, the writers just said, "Oh, to hell with it," and they went and wrote the show that they really wanted to do, which was a more genuine science fiction show with laughs. And again, like Hitchhikers, I think it is proper science fiction. I think it works as a comedy, it works as a sitcom, and it works as a proper genuine science fiction program as well, because the concepts are strong. It's not a parody of Lost in Space, and where they go, oh look, on robots in science fiction shows funny looking. They actually strive to make the robots and the model shots and the sets in Red Dwarf really, really good looking. And I mean, it's a testament to the show's still going. They did series 12 last year. They've are making it now, and I'm not the only fan out there, obviously, but yeah, I mean, I love the show, but I really put a gun to my head. I couldn't, hand on my heart, say it's my absolute favourite, because it does tie with this show, which, to my mind, is just the funniest 9 hours of comedy ever committed to anything. I mean, look at that guy's face. How can you not laugh at that? But a lot of people say that The Young Ones was the era-defining comedy, and yeah, I love the young ones. I get the argument that that it was really the show that shook things up. That was really the show that that was the game changer. Everything was different after the young ones. It was the comedy equivalent of punk rock. If Newman and Baddiel was the comedy answer equivalent of the Smiths, then the young ones was the Sex Pistols. However, Bottom is just the funniest show. It's more refined. It didn't quite have the budget of the young ones, so it was they because the young ones was it was kind of this huge show. It had musical numbers and fantasy sequences and stunts and explosions. Bottom had more of a sitcom-y budget, so they had to really hone in and just go, okay, let's just concentrate on the comedy. So Rick Mayall and Ade Edmondson essentially are playing the same characters that they played. Well, they're not the same characters, but to all intents and purposes, they're the same characters that they played in the young ones. But it's just the two of them now. So they don't have the two actors as support, and it's just about the comic interplay with them. Rick Mayall plays Richard Richard. He's kind of a middle class underachiever. Ade Edmondson is Eddie Hitler. He's a dipsomaniac, and you just get a show set in a kind of hyper real world. There's no great depth. It's not the most erudite series ever committed, but like I say, tell me show me a show that laugh for laugh is funnier. You get the comic interplay between Rick Mayall and Ade Edmondson, who wrote the show and were genuine best friends in real life, and they go, okay, what's funny? Us two chasing after birds, that's funny. Birds. Us two beating each other up, that's funny. Knob and fart gags, extreme violence, getting injured, getting rejected by women, aspersions to each other's sexuality, drinking a lot, eating a lot, farting a lot, living in a grotty flat and being losers. It's called Bottom. It's about two characters who are at the bottom of society, and yeah, it kind of has a slight erudite launching pad in that they kind of wanted to do the sitcom equivalent of Waiting for Godot, so which is the play they did at university, and they did on the West End stage actually, and you can see they were kind of in the first series they were maybe edging to something that's kind of akin to Steptoe and Son, because they kind of had these slight nods towards pathos here and there, where you got deeper insight into Richie's character and the fact that he only ever had one girlfriend and Eddie ruined it. And then there's just the odd lines here and there, like, I wonder whatever happened to my mum. But by series 2, they'd kind of thrown any sort of highbrow pretensions out the window and just gone, okay, no, we're just going to create something that's just going to make people laugh here. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a very noble aspiration to just want to make people laugh for half an hour. And you get they did the 3 series, and then they did the 5 live stage shows, of which arguably only the first one is really worth watching. Although they all have their moments. So, number 1, joint place to Red Dwarf and Bottom. Love them both. So, I've waffled on for far too long now, folks. Thanks for sticking with me if you have done. That's my top 10 favourite TV shows. Don't know what I'll do next. Maybe I'll do a top 10 least favourite something. I don't know. Welcome any ideas if you got any. But until next time, folks, this is me, Big Buddha, signing off, and I shall see you all out there in YouTube land. Top 10, this is the top 10. 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 La 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 la. Top 10, this is the top 10. 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 La 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 la. Top. As you know, again, I've talked about Red Dwarf ad nauseum. Like Hitchhiker's... Just destroyed all my DVDs. I wonder if that'll stay in. So,